That night at Joe's Diner, the neon sign flickered against the rain-soaked pavement, casting a hazy glow over the quiet street. Inside, the scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee mixed with a low hum of conversation, a typical late-night scene in a place that never really closed. The booths were mostly filled with truckers, night shift workers, and a few regulars who found comfort in the greasy warmth of the old diner. Among them sat Marcus, a man built like a mountain, but with a calm, steady presence. He wasn't loud, didn't demand attention, just sat in the corner, enjoying a plate of steak and eggs, minding his own business. Marcus was no stranger to stares. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of presence that made people glance twice. But it wasn't just his size. His skin, deep and rich in tone, had often drawn unwanted attention in places like this. He'd grown up knowing how the world worked, had learned to measure a room the moment he stepped inside. That night, he had done just that. He'd noticed the three men at the counter, laughing too loudly, throwing glances his way, the kind that held something more than just curiosity. He ignored them. He had no interest in trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had an interest in him. The men weren't from around here. Their clothes were too clean, their arrogance too sharp, like they'd never known what it meant to get their hands dirty. The leader, tall, lean, with a cruel smirk, turned toward Marcus and said something low to his friends. They laughed, not bothering to hide their amusement. One of them, a wiry guy with a shaved head, turned and raised his voice just enough to make sure Marcus heard. "Didn't know they let animals eat at the table here," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. The diner fell into a tense silence. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, froze mid-step, her face pale. A couple near the window shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The cook, a grizzled man with a grease-stained apron, shot Marcus a wary glance, as if silently asking if he was going to let it slide. Marcus didn't react. He cut another piece of his steak, chewing slowly, his expression unreadable. He'd been through worse. Words were nothing. He had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something handed over just because a fool demanded it. But the men weren't satisfied with silence. The leader leaned in, tapping his fingers against the counter. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, louder this time, pushing his chair back with an exaggerated scrape. His buddies chuckled, emboldened by his bravado. "You deaf or just stupid?" Marcus sighed, setting his fork down. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, then looked up, meeting the man's eyes for the first time. There was no fear in his gaze, no anger, just a patient sort of understanding, like a man who had seen too much to be rattled by something so small. "I'm just eating my dinner," he said, his voice even steady. "That a problem for you?" The leader laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, it is," he said, stepping closer. "See, me and my boys don't like your kind stinking up places like this. You don't belong here." A few people in the diner looked away, pretending not to hear, not wanting to get involved. The waitress took a cautious step back, her fingers gripping the edge of her notepad. The cook muttered something under his breath, but he didn't move to stop what was coming. Marcus took a slow breath. He had promised himself he wouldn't lose his temper, not over something like this. He had fought real battles, faced real enemies. He wasn't about to let three ignorant men ruin his night. But then the bold man reached for Marcus's plate, grabbing it with a smirk and tossing it onto the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain rang through the diner. The steak, perfectly cooked, landed in a mess of broken ceramic and mashed potatoes. A heavy silence followed. Marcus stared at the ruined meal, the muscles in his jaw tightening. His fingers curled slightly against the table, but still he didn't move. "You done now?" he asked, his voice lower this time, quieter. The leader grinned, not even close. Then he reached for Marcus's shoulder, shoving him just enough to test him, to see if he would break. The problem was, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know Marcus wasn't just some ordinary guy. They didn't know that before this quiet life, before the long nights and simple meals, He had served in the Marines, and they were about to find out. Marcus didn't move right away. He let the weight of the man's hand linger on his shoulder for a moment, feeling the pressure, the unspoken challenge behind it. The whole diner was holding its breath now, waiting to see what would happen next. The waitress took another step back, her fingers hovering near the phone by the register. The cook gripped the spatula in his hand a little tighter. But Marcus, he just sat there, steady as a mountain, his dark eyes locked onto the man's face, reading him. This wasn't about him, not really. It never was. Men like this, they needed to feel bigger than they were. They needed an enemy to make themselves feel strong. And tonight, they had decided that enemy was him. The bald man snickered, watching Marcus closely, searching for some sign of fear. But there was none. Instead, Marcus let out a slow breath and reached for his glass of water, taking a sip like he had all the time in the world. His hand was calm, steady. The leader's smirk faltered just a little. He hadn't expected that. He had wanted Marcus to flinch, to shrink, to get angry, anything that would justify what they were trying to do. But silence, calm, that was something they didn't know how to handle. "You got nothing to say, huh?" The leader muttered, voice losing a little of its edge. Marcus set the glass down. "I don't waste words on small men," he said simply. A flicker of something passed through the leader's eyes, a flash of anger, uncertainty. He wasn't used to being dismissed like that. His buddies shifted uneasily, glancing between him and Marcus, suddenly unsure how this was supposed to go. The bald man forced a laugh. Big talk for a guy who's about to get his. "Hey," the voice cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to look. At the end of the counter, an old man had spoken. He had been there the whole time, hunched over his coffee, wearing a worn-out trucker hat and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His skin was weathered, his hands rough with years of hard work. He didn't look like much, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, something that had seen its fair share of trouble. "You boys really want to do this?" the old man asked, tilting his head slightly. "You sure?" The leader narrowed his eyes. "What's it to you, old man?" The old man shrugged, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Just thinking," he said, setting his cup down. "You ever see a man sit that still when he's scared?" The leader frowned, glancing back at Marcus, as if really seeing him for the first time. "Man, don't flinch, don't run, don't even look worried." The old man shook his head. "That's not a man you want to mess with." The diner was dead silent now. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. The bald man shifted on his feet. "Yeah, and why's that?" The old man leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Marcus's with quiet recognition. "Because he's seen worse than you," he said, "and he's still here." Marcus didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The leader's fingers twitched at his side. He was losing control of this moment, and he knew it. He had started this to prove something, to himself, to his friends. But now doubt was creeping in. He had been in plenty of fights before, but something about this one felt different. The bald man cleared his throat. "Come on, man, let's just—" "Shut up," the leader snapped, but his voice wasn't as sure as before. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying the man. He could see the wheels turning in his head, the conflict, the fight between pride and common sense. And then something changed. The leader took a step back, then another. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands balling into fists at his sides, but he didn't move forward again. "Whatever," he muttered, shaking his head. "This place is a dump anyway." With that, he turned on his heel, storming toward the door. His friends hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks, before quickly following him. The bell above the door jingled as they pushed outside, disappearing into the night. For a long moment, no one in the diner spoke. Then, slowly, the waitress let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cook shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he returned to the grill. Conversations started to pick up again, hesitant at first, then stronger, like the diner was waking up from a bad dream. Marcus exhaled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a few bills, placing them neatly on the table. He didn't need change. As he stood, the old man at the counter gave him a nod. "Semper Fi?" the old man asked, his voice low. Marcus met his eyes and gave a small, knowing smile. "Semper Fi," he replied. And with that, he walked toward the door, stepping out into the rain, leaving behind only the memory of a man who didn't need to fight to win. The night air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and something else, something heavier. Marcus took a slow breath as he stepped outside, the cool rain pattering against his broad shoulders. The street was mostly empty, save for the distant glow of streetlights flickering down the block. He had hoped the night would be over, that the tension left inside the diner would stay there. But he knew better. A few feet away, under the awning of a closed shop, the three men lingered. Their leader stood rigid, his jaw tight, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. The other two muttered to each other, glancing in Marcus's direction, their expressions shifting between uncertainty and lingering resentment. Marcus could feel it, the unfinished business, the weight of their pride hanging in the air. They hadn't expected to back down inside the diner. They had started something they couldn't quite finish, and now it was eating at them. He kept walking, not looking in their direction, his stride steady. His car was parked just down the street, and for a brief moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, they'd let it go. But footsteps echoed behind him. Slow at first, then quicker. "Hey," the leader called out. His voice was different now, not the cocky taunt from before. There was something forced about it, like he was trying to convince himself of his own strength. "We ain't done talking." Marcus kept moving. He had no interest in giving this man another chance to prove himself. He had nothing to prove. But the footsteps picked up, and then, too close, there was a hand on his shoulder again. "Don't walk away from me," the leader said, his grip tightening. "Not after you made me look like a fool in there." Marcus stopped. He didn't turn right away. He let the rain fall between them, let the silence stretch long enough for the man to start feeling the weight of his own actions. Then slowly, Marcus turned his head, meeting the man's gaze. "I didn't make you look like a fool," Marcus said, his voice calm. "You did that yourself." A flicker of something flashed in the man's eyes. Anger, frustration, shame. The bald man shifted uncomfortably behind him, glancing toward the street like he was already thinking about leaving. The third guy, thinner, younger-looking, was chewing the inside of his cheek, his hands shoved into his hoodie. "Think you're better than me?" the leader pressed, his voice low, dangerous. "Think you can just sit there, all high and mighty, act like I'm nothing?" Marcus sighed. He had seen this before. Men like this, desperate to be seen, to be feared. He could almost hear the echoes of his past, young soldiers on their first deployment, puffing their chests, trying to prove they belonged. He had learned then that fear came in many forms, and this wasn't strength. This was fear trying to wear the mask of power. "Go home," Marcus said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." The leader's face twisted, his fingers twitching at his side like he wanted to swing, wanted to do something that would make him feel in control again. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way Marcus stood, completely unshaken. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness in his voice. Or maybe, deep down, he knew exactly how this would end. The bald man was the first to move. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Forget this, man. Let's just go." The younger guy hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, come on." But the leader, he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. His jaw clenched, his fists balled tight. Then finally, with one last glance at Marcus, he turned sharply on his heel, shoving his hands back into his pockets as he stalked off. His friends followed, silent now, their energy drained. Marcus watched them go, standing there in the rain until their footsteps faded. He let out a slow breath, then turned back toward his car. He had hoped that would be the end of it. But he had been around long enough to know better. Some battles don't end when the fight is avoided. Some wounds don't heal just because you walk away. And as he pulled open his car door, a quiet thought settled in his mind, a knowing, uneasy whisper. This wasn't over yet. Marcus sat in his car for a while, his hands gripping the wheel, his mind still replaying the events of the night. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and something about tonight felt wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that those men, especially their leader, weren't done. He'd seen that kind of determination before, the kind that doesn't back down just because the first fight didn't go their way. They were still looking for an excuse, a way to salvage their pride. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the empty street behind him. He let out a breath, wiping a hand over his face. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe he'd overthought things. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a message from his sister, Kara. Asterisk, how's it going, bro? You good? Asterisk. He stared at the screen for a moment. Kara was always looking out for him. After everything that had happened, after the war, after the time he spent away, she was the only one who truly understood the weight he carried. He could text her back, tell her everything was fine, but that wouldn't be true. He didn't even know what to say to her. He typed out a quick reply, asterisk kind good, just tired, asterisk. His phone buzzed again almost immediately. Asterisk, don't let them get to you. You've come too far to let anything like that ruin your night. Asterisk. Marcus smiled to himself, the warmth of her words sinking in for just a moment. She was right. He had fought battles far worse than this. But this wasn't about fighting, not really. It was about something deeper. Something he couldn't quite put into words. The message didn't erase the tension in his chest, though. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel as he glanced around the empty street again. Something was off. He started the engine, determined to head home, to leave this mess behind. But as soon as he pulled out of the parking lot, he noticed the headlights in his rearview mirror. At first, it was just another car on a quiet street, but then they didn't pass. The lights stayed behind him, too close. Marcus's grip on the wheel tightened. He glanced to his left, then his right. No other cars on the road. He was alone, but not really. The car behind him was getting closer now, staying just out of reach, but never leaving him. It was deliberate. He hit the gas, but so did they. The car sped up, matching his pace. Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind already running through scenarios. He wasn't afraid. No, he had faced real danger before. But this was different. The car behind him swerved, pulling up next to his vehicle. Through the darkened window, he could see the face of the leader, eyes locked onto him. His jaw was clenched, a twisted look of fury replacing the cocky grin from earlier. The leader revved the engine, his car edging closer to Marcus's, forcing him to veer slightly to the side. Thought you could walk away, huh? The leader's voice was muffled, but Marcus could hear the malice in every word. You're not gonna get away that easy. Marcus didn't flinch. He wasn't about to get dragged into this, not over something so petty. But the leader wasn't stopping. The car pulled alongside him, and before Marcus could react, the bald man from earlier lunged out of the passenger side window, throwing something heavy at his car. It hit with a sickening thud, cracking the driver's side mirror. Marcus's heart skipped. Anger surged through him, but he kept a level head. He had dealt with worse. He had dealt with chaos that made this look like child's play. But these men were pushing him to a point where the calm facade he had worked so hard to build felt like it was slipping. The leader's car swerved in front of him now, cutting him off. The bold man hopped out, his hands raised in challenge, his face twisted into something savage. You think you can just walk away from us, he shouted. You think you can just sit there, act like nothing happened. Marcus's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to do this. Not like this. But he was running out of options. He slammed the brakes, sending his car skidding to a stop just a few feet from the leader's vehicle. His breath was steady, but his mind was racing. The leader climbed out of his car, his eyes wild now, the anger boiling over into something dangerous. His friends followed, each of them glaring at Marcus like he was the enemy. "You've got one last chance, big guy," the leader sneered, his hands balled into fists. "Walk away now, or we'll make you wish you had." Marcus's gaze flicked from one man to the next. They were desperate to prove something, to save face. But this wasn't a fight he was going to lose. Still, he didn't move. He just sat there, eyes locked on the leader, waiting for the next move, waiting for them to make the first mistake. And when they did, when they crossed that line, he would be ready. The tension between them hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Marcus stayed still, calm, but his mind was sharp, every muscle in his body wound tight. The leader and his men were circling now, sizing him up, trying to figure out where he would break, how they could push him into the fight they wanted. The night was thick with the sound of their ragged breaths and the soft hum of the rain falling steadily, almost too quiet for what was about to happen. Then, just as Marcus thought they would make their move, just as the leader's hand twitched like he was about to lunge, there was a flash of headlights from behind. The men froze. Marcus didn't turn around, but he could feel the shift in the air. The newcomer's headlights illuminated the street, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. For a moment, the scene felt like a standoff, but it wasn't just him they were focused on anymore. The car pulled up slowly, the engine growling, and then it stopped just a few feet away from Marcus's own. The window rolled down with a mechanical hum, and a figure stepped out, tall, broad, and unmistakable. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The man was wearing a heavy leather jacket, and the way he moved, there was something deliberate about it, something familiar. The faint glow of the streetlights revealed his face, and Marcus's stomach clenched. It was a man from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years. It was Carter, the man who had been his commanding officer during the last tour in the desert, the man who had walked away from the war scarred in ways that Marcus had never understood. Carter's eyes were cold, distant now, but the fire that had once burned so fiercely inside him was still there. Marcus had always admired Carter, looked up to him like a brother, but he had no idea what had happened to him after the war. After they parted ways, Carter had slipped off the grid, disappearing into the world of shadows and violence that often consumed those who came home from the front lines. Now here he was, standing between Marcus and the gang, his presence an unspoken challenge, a warning. The leader of the gang took a step back, his face draining of color as Carter's eyes locked onto him. "Who the hell are you?" The leader spat, trying to hide the unease in his voice. Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a long, measured look at Marcus, his gaze lingering on him for a second longer than necessary. There was something unreadable in Carter's eyes, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't here to help. He was here to take control. "You're in the wrong place, friend," Carter finally said, his voice low, carrying a weight that made the leader step back, even though he didn't want to. The leader's bravado faltered, and his gang mates exchanged uneasy glances. Carter stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wet pavement with each deliberate step. He didn't say another word. His presence alone was enough. The bald man shifted nervously, muttering something under his breath. Then, with a sudden movement, Carter raised his hand. The gang members froze. "You," Carter said, pointing to the leader, "get in your car. Now." The leader opened his mouth to protest, but Carter's voice cut through the air, as sharp as a blade. "You don't want to be here when I'm finished." The tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just a matter of physical strength anymore. It was about control. Carter was here to dominate the situation, to take the power back, and the leader knew it. Without a word, the leader's face twisted into something that could only be described as fear. The bravado was gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable. He turned, almost running back to his car. His two companions followed without a word, their faces drawn with uncertainty, unwilling to challenge Carter any further. But as they got into their car, Marcus noticed something, a subtle change in the way the leader looked at him. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was something else in his eyes, something darker. Carter watched them go, his eyes never leaving the vehicle until it disappeared into the distance. Then he turned to Marcus, his expression unreadable. "You all right?" Carter asked, his voice strangely soft, though his stance remained firm. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He wanted to. He wanted to ask so many things. Where had Carter been? Why had he shown up now, of all times? Was this some kind of coincidence, or was there more to it than that? Carter's eyes narrowed, reading Marcus like he always had. "You look like you've got questions, but you're not gonna like the answers." Marcus took a step back, his hand still on the car door. The mystery of the night had taken an unexpected turn, and it felt like they were teetering on the edge of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. The gang was one thing, but Carter... Marcus had no idea where this was headed, but he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, heavier than anything else. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, a distant sound reached his ears, the unmistakable screech of tires on wet pavement. Without thinking, he spun around. The gang car had turned back. Only this time, it wasn't just the leader and his crew. There were more cars now. Dozens of them, headlights blinding and blurring the street ahead. The leader's face appeared again, twisted in anger, his hand gripping something at his side. And this time, they weren't backing down. The screech of tires grew louder, echoing down the street like a battle cry. The headlights of the cars grew brighter, washing over Marcus and Carter as they stood there, locked in a moment of frozen uncertainty. The leader's car was at the front, but this time, there were more, too many to count. The gang had returned, and they weren't here to back down. They were here to end it. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Carter, whose jaw was set, his eyes scanning the approaching cars with the calm precision of someone who had seen this before. "You need to get out of here," Carter said, his voice low but urgent. "This is gonna get messy." Marcus shook his head. "Not without you." Before Carter could respond, the leader's car slammed to a stop in front of them, blocking their path. The doors flew open, and the men spilled out, more of them now, each carrying the kind of energy that made Marcus's instincts flare. They weren't just looking for a fight anymore, they were looking for blood. The leader stepped out first, his hands already raised. A smug grin spread across his face as he looked at Marcus. "You really thought you could walk away?" Carter's eyes never left the leader. "I told you to leave." His voice had shifted now, becoming colder, more commanding. He stepped forward, a quiet challenge hanging in the air. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, everything broke loose. The leader lunged at Carter, but Carter was already moving, his body a blur as he sidestepped, grabbing the leader's arm and twisting it behind him with brutal precision. The leader yelped, but Carter didn't stop. He shoved him forward, sending him stumbling into the street. The other men hesitated for a second, unsure whether to attack or retreat, but Carter didn't give them the time to decide. With one swift movement, he took out the first man who charged, his knee slamming into the man's stomach before sending him crashing to the ground. Another man came at Marcus from the side, swinging a crowbar, but Marcus was faster. He ducked, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted it until the weapon fell from his hand. Marcus shoved him back, using his weight to send the guy stumbling into one of the parked cars. Chaos erupted. The men came at them in waves, but Carter and Marcus moved like a well-oiled machine, instinctively covering each other's backs. Every strike, every move was calculated, a dance they'd both been trained in. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every man they took down, 2 more stepped forward. The gang wasn't giving up. Marcus's breath was ragged, his body aching from the blows he had already taken, but he wasn't backing down. He couldn't. This wasn't just about him or Carter anymore. It was about something deeper, about standing up for what was right, for refusing to let hate and violence win. Then, Just as he thought he might finally be worn down, something changed. A loud crash echoed from the distance, the sound of an engine revving, and then a car screeched to a halt just behind the gang. Marcus's eyes widened in shock as a new figure emerged from the vehicle, someone familiar, someone he hadn't seen in years. It was his sister, Kara. She stepped out of the driver's seat, holding a tire iron in her hand like it was just another tool. Her eyes were fierce, full of a fire that Marcus hadn't seen before. She didn't hesitate. Without a word, she charged into the fray, swinging the tire iron with precision. "Get back," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The gang members froze, eyes darting to the new threat, but Kara was already in motion. She spun again, knocking one of the men off his feet, then turned to another, hitting him square in the ribs. The gang was scattered, caught off guard by the sudden arrival of this unexpected force. For the first time in what felt like forever, the balance tipped. Marcus watched in awe as Kara took control of the scene, her movements quick, calculated. She wasn't just swinging wildly, she was dismantling them one by one, her strikes quick and precise. It was clear she had been through her own share of battles. But even as the tide shifted, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something deeper. He took a step back, scanning the scene, his mind racing. That's when he saw it. The leader had disappeared. The man who had caused this whole mess, who had threatened him, was gone. Marcus's gut twisted. The man had retreated, but not out of fear, out of strategy. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just about a fight. It was a setup. Before he could process the thought, a voice broke through the noise, distant but growing louder. "Marcus." It was Carter. Marcus turned just in time to see Carter on the ground, a sharp glint of metal in his hand. The leader had reappeared, and he wasn't alone. He had a gun, aimed directly at Carter. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. Marcus's body moved before his brain had time to catch up. He dove toward Carter, but the leader fired. The shot rang out, and Marcus's heart stopped. But it wasn't Carter who fell. It was the leader. A second shot echoed through the night, and the leader collapsed, his weapon falling from his hand. Kara was standing there, breathless, her hand still holding the tire iron, smoke curling from the muzzle of her gun. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was deafening. The gang was gone, scattered, no longer a threat. The leader, the source of all the trouble, was now lying motionless on the pavement. And in that moment, as the weight of everything they had been through settled over them, Marcus realized that this wasn't just a victory over the men who had attacked him. It was a victory for something greater, for family, for strength in the face of hate. But just as Marcus thought the story was over, just as he felt the relief of knowing it was finally done, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A shadow in the distance, the car pulling up slowly, its headlights piercing the dark, and behind the wheel, the unmistakable figure of someone he never thought he'd see again. It was someone from his past, someone much darker than anything he had faced tonight. The car slowly rolled to a stop, its headlights cutting through the foggy night. The silhouette behind the wheel was unmistakable, broad-shouldered, dark eyes gleaming with an intensity that Marcus could never forget. It was John. John, a figure from Marcus's past, someone who had been a ghost for years, someone whose name carried a weight of betrayal and darkness. Marcus's pulse quickened, his breath caught in his throat. He never expected this, never imagined that, after everything, John would come back into his life in this way. The car door opened and John stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he made his way toward them. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the grimness in his demeanor. "Didn't think you'd be here, John," Marcus said, his voice steady but his body tense, ready for anything. John stopped a few feet away, his eyes briefly scanning the scene. His gaze lingered on the fallen gang members, the chaos that had unfolded in the last few minutes. Then his eyes met Marcus's. "I didn't think I'd be here either," John replied, his voice low. But it seems the past has a way of catching up with us. The tension between them was palpable, but Marcus could see it in John's face, the weight of the years, the distance, the choices that had led them to this moment. The betrayal wasn't just in what had happened, it was in the years of silence, of unanswered questions. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his tone now sharper, suspicion creeping in. John didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the scene as though searching for something that wasn't immediately visible. The silence between them stretched, each second heavier than the last. Then, with a deep breath, John finally spoke. "You know, Marcus," he said, "I didn't come here to fight. I came to stop this." He waved his hand over the scattered gang members, the chaos that had engulfed the street. "This, everything that happened tonight, it's just a part of something bigger." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" John looked at him, his gaze serious. "There's a reason those guys came after you. And it wasn't just for the sake of a fight. They were being paid to do it. Someone out there has been pulling strings. And they're not done." Marcus felt his stomach twist. His mind raced. He had suspected something more, but hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. This was bigger than a random attack. This was part of something that ran deeper, something more dangerous. "How do you know this?" Marcus asked, his voice rising slightly. John took a slow breath, as though debating whether to continue. "I've been keeping tabs on them. On the ones who've been moving in the shadows. After I left the service, I found out that the people who funded the gang, people who orchestrated all this, they've got a hand in far more than just this city." Marcus's heart began to race. "Who are they?" John looked down for a moment, a flicker of something in his eyes. "I don't have all the details, but it's the kind of operation that doesn't just attack one person. It's bigger than that. These guys, the ones who tried to hurt you, they're part of a much larger syndicate. And I'm not just talking about petty criminals. These people run businesses, investments, even politics. You've been targeted because you're part of something they want to keep hidden, something you didn't even know about." Marcus stood frozen, the weight of John's words sinking in. All the pieces were starting to come together, but it felt like a puzzle that was too big, too complex for him to fully understand. He had thought the fight was over, the fight with the gang, the struggle against the hate, against the random cruelty of the world. But this was something much darker. John took a step forward, his eyes locking with Marcus's. "I'm not here to drag you into this again, but you need to know the truth. You're more connected to this than you realize. I didn't want to tell you, but after everything that's happened," he paused, his voice softening. "I owe you this." The air was thick with silence as Marcus processed everything. His mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. But the truth was, he wasn't sure he was ready for any of it. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "You're not the only one who's been watching." It was Kara. She had come up behind them, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the situation. Her expression was grim, but there was something else in her gaze, determination. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Kara stepped forward, her hand on the tire iron she had used earlier. "I've been keeping an eye on things too. I don't know all the details, but I've heard whispers. And I don't think this ends with the gang. I think they were just the beginning." She looked at John, then back at Marcus. "I think this is just the tip of the iceberg." John nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "She's right. Whoever's behind this, they won't stop until they get what they want. And right now, they're after something that could bring everything down. Everything we fought for." For a moment, the world felt impossibly heavy. The night, the rain, the silence, it all seemed to weigh down on Marcus's shoulders. He had wanted peace, to leave the past behind, to find some kind of closure. But now, it seemed like the past wasn't done with him, and the world he had tried to walk away from was coming back with a vengeance. "I can't do this alone," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. John stepped forward, a look of understanding in his eyes. "You don't have to. We're in this together. You've already been pulled in, whether you like it or not." But now we fight back. Kara nodded. We take control. We fight for what's right. Marcus took a deep breath. He was tired. He had fought so much, and now he was being asked to step back into the chaos. But there was something inside him that refused to back down. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking a stand, about making sure this didn't spiral out of control. "All right," Marcus said, his voice unwavering now. "Let's finish this." The three of them stood there, looking out at the city that had brought them together. They didn't know what the future held or how this war would play out, but they knew one thing for certain: they weren't going to let the darkness win. They had been through too much, fought too hard, to let it all fall apart now. And with that, they set off into the night, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together they could confront the shadows, no matter how deep they ran.